Plainfield, Wisconsin, 1957. A town so small everyone knew everyone, or thought they did. But behind the peeling paint of a lonely farmhouse, a horror was taking shape. One that would shock America, inspire Hollywood's most terrifying villains, and leave a permanent scar on the nation's psyche. This is the story of Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to our channel, because the truth is often stranger, darker, and more disturbing than fiction, and you won't want to miss the stories we uncover next. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin. The second of two sons, Ed grew up under the iron grip of his mother, Augusta, a fiercely religious woman who preached that the world was evil, that women were sinful, and that salvation could only be found through strict moral purity. She read to her boys from the Bible every afternoon, not the comforting verses, but the ones about death, punishment, and divine wrath. His father, George, was a carpenter and tanner, but also a heavy drinker. In 1914, the family moved to a 155-acre farm in the rural town of Plainfield. Isolated from the outside world, Augusta kept her sons away from neighbors, convinced that contact with others would corrupt them. Ed was shy, socially awkward, and often laughed to himself, a nervous, unsettling habit that classmates remembered for years. In 1940, Ed's father died of heart failure. Ed and his older brother Henry began working odd jobs to support themselves and their mother. But Henry worried about Ed's unhealthy attachment to Augusta. He spoke critically of her, and in May 1944, during a marsh fire on their property, Henry was found dead under mysterious circumstances. The official cause was asphyxiation, but bruises on his head raised questions that were never answered. When Augusta died in December 1945, Ed was devastated. He boarded up her rooms, leaving them untouched while the rest of the farmhouse decayed into filth. Alone, he turned to pulp magazines and lurid stories of cannibals and Nazi atrocities. And somewhere in that isolation, something inside him broke. November 16th, 1957, the first day of deer hunting season in Wisconsin. In Plainfield, most of the men were out in the woods, which meant the town's hardware store was quiet. Bernice Worden, the 58-year-old store owner, was working alone. She was well-liked, dependable, and had run the shop for years. But by the end of that day, she would vanish without a trace. That morning, a local man named Ed Gein had stopped by the store. He told Bernice he needed antifreeze. It was a simple purchase, nothing unusual. But when her son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Worden, returned later that afternoon, the store was empty. The cash register was open, and there were bloodstains on the floor. Frank found the last receipt written that morning for antifreeze sold to Ed Gein. Police moved quickly. Gein was a familiar face in town, odd, quiet, but seemingly harmless. He lived alone on his family's farm, a place most people avoided. That night, officers drove out to the property. The farmhouse was dark, the yard littered with rusting machinery and broken tools. Inside, the air was thick with a stench so foul it clung to their clothes. In a shed behind the house, an officer's flashlight beam caught something hanging from the rafters. At first, they thought it was a deer carcass, common during hunting season. But as they stepped closer, the truth froze them in place. It was Bernice Worden. She had been decapitated, her body dressed out like an animal. The horror didn't stop there. Inside the farmhouse, Investigators found a scene so grotesque it defied belief. Human skulls repurposed as bowls, chairs upholstered with human skin, a lampshade made from a human face, boxes of bones, and in a paper bag, the face of Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who had gone missing in 1954. The rooms Augusta once occupied were pristine, untouched since her death. But the rest of the house was a nightmare. A museum of death and desecration. Ed Gein had been robbing graves for years, exhuming bodies from local cemeteries, and using the remains to fashion macabre trophies. In his mind, he was trying to recreate his mother, even making a woman suit from human skin so he could, as he later confessed, become her. The discovery sent shockwaves through Plainfield. This wasn't just murder, it was something far darker, something that blurred the line between the living and the dead. And as the news spread, the legend of the Butcher of Plainfield began to take shape. Ed Gein was taken into custody without a fight. He didn't run. He didn't protest. He simply sat in the back of the squad car, quiet, almost relieved. But what he was about to tell investigators would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Gein confessed to making dozens of nighttime trips to local cemeteries. He would read the obituaries, choose freshly buried women who reminded him of his mother, and under the cover of darkness, dig them up. He described the process in chilling detail, how he would take only what he needed, sometimes the entire body, sometimes just certain parts. He said he was in a daze during these acts, as if something else was controlling him. Investigators were skeptical until they checked the cemeteries themselves. In the frozen Wisconsin ground, they found disturbed graves exactly where Gein said they would be. Coffins pried open, bodies missing. The evidence was undeniable. The more Gein talked, the more grotesque the picture became. He admitted to creating masks from human faces, wearing them around the house. He described making a vest of human skin, complete with breasts, so he could become his mother. Detectives, hardened by years on the job, left the room to compose themselves. Some refused to go back in. Forensic teams cataloged every item from the Gein farmhouse. The list read like something from a horror novel. Skulls on bedposts, a belt made of nipples, a box of preserved noses. Each piece was photographed, tagged, and stored, though many would later be destroyed due to their disturbing nature. The case against Ed Gein was airtight, but the question remained: was he a cold-blooded killer or a deeply disturbed man who had lost all grip on reality? That answer would determine whether he faced prison or a lifetime in a mental institution. Bernice Worden's murder was the crime that finally exposed Ed Gein, but it wasn't the only mystery tied to his name. As investigators dug deeper, they began to connect him to another disappearance, one that had haunted Plainfield for 3 years. Mary Hogan was a 51-year-old tavern owner, known for her loud laugh and sharp tongue. In December 1954, she vanished from her bar without a trace. The only clue left behind was a pool of blood on the tavern floor. For years, her case went cold, until police found her face carefully preserved in a paper bag inside Gein's farmhouse. When confronted, Gein admitted to killing her. But in his strange, detached way, he spoke about Mary as if she were still alive, sometimes referring to her in the present tense. It was as though, in his mind, death didn't sever the connection, it just changed it. Rumors began to swirl. Had Gein killed more than these 2 women? Some locals whispered about other missing persons, unexplained disappearances from nearby towns. But Gein insisted that most of the remains in his home came from grave robbing, not murder. Investigators could never prove otherwise, though many believed there were victims whose names we'll never know. One of the most unsettling twists was Gein's own explanation for his crimes. He claimed he was trying to build a version of his mother, using the skin and bones of women who resembled her. In his mind, he wasn't killing for pleasure or profit. He was reconstructing the only person he had ever truly loved and feared in equal measure. The line between murderer and grave robber blurred. Was Ed Gein a serial killer in the traditional sense, or something far stranger? A man whose obsession with his mother drove him into a world of death and desecration. The courts would soon have to decide. But first, the public would have to confront the full horror of what had been living among them. By the time Ed Gein's case reached the courts, the nation already knew his name. Newspapers called him a ghoul, a madman, a monster. But the question before the judge wasn't just about guilt. It was about sanity. In January 1958, Gein was formally charged with the murder of Bernice Worden. The evidence was overwhelming. The body in his shed, the receipts, the rifle. But his defense argued that he was legally insane, incapable of understanding the moral weight of his actions. Psychiatric evaluations painted a disturbing picture. A man with severe mental illness, trapped in a delusional world where his mother's voice still guided him from beyond the grave. Gein was diagnosed with schizophrenia and deemed unfit to stand trial. Instead of prison, he was committed to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin. For more than a decade, he remained there, quiet, polite, even helpful to staff. But in 1968, doctors declared him competent to stand trial. The proceedings were brief. Gein waived his right to a jury, leaving the verdict in the hands of Judge Robert H. Gulmar. The trial focused solely on Bernice Worden's murder. Gein's confession, the physical evidence, and the forensic findings left no room for doubt. On November 14, 1968, the judge found him guilty, but once again ruled him legally insane. Gein was returned to a mental institution, this time for the rest of his life. There would be no death sentence, no prison cell. Instead, Ed Gein faded into the quiet routines of hospital life. Far from the farmhouse that had once been his private chamber of horrors, when the gavel fell for the last time, Plainfield tried to move on. But how do you return to normal when the most infamous crime scene in America sits just down the road? The Gein farmhouse stood for years after his arrest, a rotting shell filled with memories the town wanted to forget. In 1958, it was scheduled to be auctioned off, but before that could happen, the house mysteriously burned to the ground. Whether it was an accident or an act of arson, no one ever proved. Many locals quietly admitted they were relieved. The land was cleared, the physical reminder erased, but the story could never be buried. Ed Gein spent the rest of his life in state mental hospitals. He was described as a model patient, polite, cooperative, even friendly. He enjoyed reading, doing odd jobs, and playing cards with staff, but he never expressed remorse for his crimes. On July 26, 1984, at the age of 77, Ed Gein died of respiratory failure due to cancer. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery, not far from the graves he once disturbed. But Gein's legacy didn't end with his death. His crimes inspired some of the most iconic horror characters in history. Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. Each took pieces of his twisted reality and turned them into cinematic nightmares. Even decades later, his name is shorthand for the darkest corners of the human mind. For Plainfield, the wounds never fully healed. Older residents still remember the day the news broke, the disbelief, the fear, the shame. And for true crime historians, Ed Gein remains a case study in isolation, obsession, and the terrifying lengths a person can go when untethered from reality. Ed Gein's story is more than a catalog of horrors. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always look like the monster in the shadows. Sometimes, it wears the face of the quiet neighbor, the man who helps with odd jobs, the one you'd never suspect. In Plainfield, that realization cut deeper than any headline. The farmhouse is gone. The fields have grown over. But the name, Ed Gein, still hangs in the air like a ghost. His crimes forced America to confront the unimaginable, to ask how isolation, obsession, and grief could twist a human mind into something unrecognizable. And maybe that's why his story endures. Because it's not just about what he did, it's about the unsettling truth that we never really know what darkness might be hiding behind the next closed door. If you've stayed with us through this journey into the Butcher of Plainfield's world, you know the truth is often far stranger and far more disturbing than fiction. Subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories told the way they were meant to be told, with every chilling detail, every unanswered question, and every shadow left unexplored. Because somewhere out there, the next story is already waiting.